The world we inhabit today is not made of stone or steel, but of logic etched into microscopic layers of silicon. Every interaction you have, every message you send, and the very video you are watching right now is the result of a silent, microscopic struggle for dominance that has spanned more than 50 years. We often take the technology in our pockets for granted, assuming it was the inevitable result of brilliant minds working toward a grand vision. But what if I told you that the heart of your computer was born from a shortcut, a temporary fix, and a desperate attempt to save money? Before we dive into the deep history of the Silicon Wars, I invite you to consider the device you are holding. Does it serve you, or do you serve the architecture that defines its limits? If you value these deep dives into the hidden forces of our world, please subscribe to the channel and join our community of thinkers. The story of the modern central processing unit did not begin with a grand ambition to change the world. In the late 1960s, the world of computing was a landscape of giants, where machines filled entire rooms and were built with single-purpose circuits. A Japanese company called Bizicom approached a young, struggling startup named Intel with a request to design 12 custom chips for a new electronic calculator. At the time, Intel was primarily a memory company, and designing 12 distinct, complex chips was an overwhelming task for their small engineering team. This bottleneck of resources forced a young engineer named Marchain Hoff to propose a radical, elegant alternative. Instead of building 12 specialized chips, why not build one general-purpose processor that could be programmed to do whatever the software required? This was the first great reinvention, the moment hardware surrendered its sovereignty to software. With the quiet backing of Intel co-founder Robert Noyce and the technical genius of Federico Faggin and Stan Mazur, the Intel 4004 was born in 1971. It was the world's first commercial microprocessor, a tiny sliver of silicon that contained the equivalent of 2,300 transistors. Intel's own marketing department was skeptical, believing that the market for such a device was perhaps a few thousand units at most. They could not yet see that by making hardware programmable, they had created a universal tool that would eventually consume every other industry. It was a shift from the physical to the abstract, where the utility of a machine was no longer fixed at the factory, but limited only by the imagination of the programmer. By the mid-1970s, the silicon genie was out of the bottle, and the lab experiments began to flood the streets. Intel continued to iterate with the 8008 and the 8080, each version becoming more capable and easier for outsiders to understand. Suddenly, the power to compute was no longer locked behind the gates of massive corporations or government research centers. This era of the late 1970s created a playground for hobbyists, including two teenagers in Seattle named Bill Gates and Paul Allen. They saw the potential of these chips not as calculator components, but as the foundation for an entirely new kind of industry. As Intel pushed forward, the market began to fracture and compete with a ferocity that defines the tech world to this day. Former Intel engineers, frustrated by corporate limits, left to found Zilog and created the Z80, a chip that would become a legend in early home computing. Motorola entered the fray with the 6800, while another group of breakaway engineers formed Noah's Technology. This small team developed the 6502, a chip so affordable and efficient that it became the heart of the Apple I and Apple II. This was the microcomputer explosion, a period where the CPU evolved from a niche component into a recognized product category that defined the capabilities of a new generation of dreamers. However, the most consequential moment in the history of the CPU occurred in 1981, a year that would set the course for the next 4 decades. IBM, the undisputed titan of the computing world, decided to enter the personal computer market and chose Intel S8088 as the brain of their machine. This choice was not necessarily based on technical superiority, as there were more powerful chips available at the time. It was a decision based on pragmatism, supply chains, and the need for a quick launch. That single selection transformed Intel from a mere supplier into the gravitational center of the entire global technology ecosystem. Throughout the 1980s, the x86 architecture became the undisputed law of the land. Successive generations of chips like the 2086, the 3086, and the 4086 cemented Intel's dominance over the personal computer. The introduction of the 3086 in 1986 was particularly pivotal, as it featured 32-bit processing and allowed Intel to assert its own architectural leadership. For the first time, Intel was not just following IBM's lead. It was dictating the pace of innovation for the entire industry. This era proved that once an architecture gains enough momentum, its legacy and software compatibility become a moat that is almost impossible to breach. While Intel was building an empire on the x86, a quiet rebellion was brewing in the halls of academia. Researchers like David Patterson at the University of California, Berkeley, and John Hennessy at Stanford began to question the complexity of traditional CPU designs. They argued that the instruction sets of chips like the x86 had become bloated and inefficient, trying to do too much in a single step. Their solution was RISC, or reduced instruction set computing, a philosophy that favored a small number of simple, fast instructions that could be executed in a highly efficient pipeline. This was more than a technical disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies between the old guard and the new thinkers. By the early 1990s, the RISC philosophy had moved from the classroom to the high-end workstation market. Hennessy's MIPS architecture began powering powerful systems from Silicon Graphics and Digital Equipment Corporation. Sun Microsystems adopted the SPARC architecture, while Hewlett-Packard and DC developed their own high-performance RISC designs like PA RISC and the legendary Alpha. For a moment, it seemed that the x86 was a dinosaur, a relic of a less efficient era that would soon be outclassed by the elegant simplicity of RISC. These RISC machines dominated the world of servers and scientific computing, leaving x86 to handle the supposedly simpler tasks of the home and office. Intel, however, understood a fundamental truth about power. It is not always the most elegant design that wins, but the one that can adapt without breaking the past. In the mid-1990s, Intel executed a brilliant architectural maneuver with the Pentium Pro and subsequent designs. They realized they could not abandon the complex x86 instruction set because they would lose their massive software ecosystem. Instead, they built a CPU that looked like an x86 chip on the outside but acted like a RISC chip on the inside. This internal translation layer allowed them to use RISC-like efficiencies while maintaining perfect compatibility with existing software. This engineering brute force, combined with Intel's massive manufacturing advantages, began to close the performance gap with the high-end RISC vendors. As the 1990s came to a close, the fragmented RISC market began to crumble under the weight of its own diversity. Each RISC vendor had its own operating system and its own niche, preventing them from achieving the economies of scale that Intel enjoyed. One by one, the great workstation companies began to fade away or switch to Intel hardware. The x86 architecture had survived its greatest philosophical challenge not by being more elegant, but by being more relentless and strategically flexible. The dawn of the new millennium brought a moment of profound hubris for Intel, leading to one of the most famous failures in tech history. Believing that the x86 architecture had finally reached its physical limits, Intel partnered with HP to create Itanium. This was a completely new architecture designed to replace x86 entirely, using a complex system where the software compiler handled the heavy lifting of organizing instructions. But Itanium was a disaster because it ignored the lesson of history. People do not want to start over from scratch. The chip was difficult to program, performance was lackluster, and most importantly, it could not run old software efficiently. While Intel was distracted by the Itanium failure, their rival AMD saw an opportunity to redefine the future. Led by visionary architects like Jim Keller, AMD introduced a 64-bit extension to the existing x86 design, known as AMD 64. It was a stroke of genius that allowed for massive memory addresses while maintaining full, native compatibility with 32-bit applications. This was the third major reinvention of the CPU, the realization that evolution is often more powerful than revolution. The industry chose AMD's path, and eventually, Intel was forced to adopt the very standard their rival had created to survive. From 2006 to 2015, Intel entered what many consider its golden age of dominance. With the introduction of the Core microarchitecture and the famous tick-tock manufacturing strategy, Intel seemed invincible. They consistently delivered smaller, faster transistors every 2 years, while their competitors struggled to keep up. During this decade, AMD faced internal turmoil, high-profile project failures, and the difficult decision to sell off its manufacturing facilities. For nearly 10 years, there was no real competition in the high-end PC and server market, and Intel's blue logo became synonymous with the very idea of a computer. However, while Intel was focused on dominating the desktop and the server room, a different kind of revolution was happening in our pockets. Outside the spotlight of the PC world, RISC architectures had never truly gone away. They had simply moved into embedded systems where power efficiency was more important than raw speed. Chips based on the MIPS architecture powered everything from home routers and printers to legendary game consoles like the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. Even in Japan, companies like Hitachi developed unique RISC designs like the Super H for Sega systems. These chips proved that there was still a massive, albeit quieter, market for specialized silicon. The most important survivor of the RISC era was a small company in the United Kingdom called ARM. In the 1990s, ARM realized it could not compete with Intel by selling chips directly, so it pioneered a revolutionary business model, licensing IP. Instead of making the silicon, ARM designed the architecture and the cores, then sold the rights to other companies to build their own versions. This strategy was initially just a way for ARM to stay afloat, but it eventually positioned them perfectly for the mobile phone explosion. When Nokia chose an ARM-based processor for its GSM phones, it set a standard that would eventually conquer the world. The mobile revolution was the fourth reinvention of the CPU, driven not by the need for more power, but by the need for extreme efficiency and integration. As smartphones became the primary way the world accessed the internet, the number of ARM chips produced every year began to dwarf the number of x86 chips. ARM became the most widely deployed architecture in human history because it allowed 1,000 different companies to create 1,000 different specialized chips. This taught us that in a connected world, the ability to be everywhere is more valuable than the ability to be the strongest in a single room. As we moved into the 2010s, a new challenge to the status quo emerged from the very place where the RISC movement began. The University of California, Berkeley. Kresta and his team of students realized that as computing became more fundamental to society, the instruction sets themselves should be free. They developed RISC-V, an open-source, royalty-free instruction set architecture that anyone could use, modify, or extend without paying a cent to a gatekeeper. This was the fifth reinvention, the move toward democratic silicon. RISC-V represents a structural shift where the design of a CPU is no longer a proprietary secret, but a shared global resource. Today, we find ourselves in an uneasy stalemate between three great powers, x86, ARM, and RISC-V. The battlefield has shifted from the design of the instructions to the mastery of the manufacturing process. For the first time in decades, Intel has lost its process, leading to foundries like TSMC in Taiwan, allowing companies like Apple and AMD to create chips that are significantly more efficient than anything Intel can currently produce. Apple's transition to its own silicon has proven that ARM can compete at the highest levels of performance, while RISC-V is rapidly becoming the standard for everything from automotive sensors to massive data center accelerators. This history shows us that the CPU is never truly finished. It is a living entity that must be reinvented to survive the changing needs of the world. We have seen how a calculator shortcut became a global standard, how academic theories became the heart of our smartphones, and how open-source ideals are now challenging multi-billion-dollar monopolies. The lesson is clear: no architecture, no matter how dominant, is safe from the cycle of reinvention. Success breeds complacency, and complacency creates the very vacuum that a new, hungrier challenger will eventually fill. As you look at the world around you, remember that the tools we use define the thoughts we can have. The history of the CPU is a testament to human ingenuity and the power of adaptation. It reminds us that when we face a limitation, we have two choices. We can try to force the world to fit our old ways, or we can reinvent ourselves to meet the future. In your own life, are you clinging to an outdated architecture of thought, or are you willing to perform the hard work of a total reinvention? What part of your own internal code is holding you back from reaching your true potential? Thank you for joining me on this journey through the heart of the machine. I hope this story has given you a new perspective on the invisible forces that shape our digital lives. If you found this narrative compelling, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below.